We are up to 80A, Daf Pei Amud Aleph. We're at the bottom of the Amud, and we're in the midst of the conversation about when the community itself is tamei, the community is the majority of the community is tamei, is ritually impure and cannot bring the korban Pesach. However, not everybody is a tamei in a korban Pesach, tamei in a form that would allow them to bring the korban Pesach this way in a communal tumah, such as zava. If the people that are tamei, the majority of people that are tamei from zav, which is either abnormal male bodily fluid, which is, let's say, gonorrhea, or for a female, it is an abnormal menstrual flow, which doesn't come at the typical time. So then, if you're a zav or a zava, so that tumah would not be included in the exclusion in the postponement of tumah, or the bringing of the korban Pesach betumah. And so the Gemara had asked, what happens if you have the majority are zav? So the majority of the community is tamei, but they can't bring the korban Pesach the first time around. However, the minority of the community are tamei of mace, but since the entirety of the community is tamei, they should be able to bring the korban Pesach. However, the form of tumah is not the type of tumah that would allow them to bring the korban Pesach while tamei in the first time around. So when do they bring the korban Pesach the second time around or not? That's we saw yesterday the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. This morning we're going to go into another case, and this is the sixth last line of 80A in Pesachim. Itma, hayaruban tamei meis. The majority of the community are tamei meis, meaning that they became tamei through contact with a deceased person. Miutan zavin, and the minority of the community are a form of tumah that cannot bring the first korban Pesach. This is even though that they are tamei, and the majority of the community is tamei of another form of tumah, and they're bringing the korban Pesach even though that they're ritually impure, they're a tamei. And you have a minority of the community, zavin, where they are a form of tumah of bodily fluid, the form of tumah that does not allow them to bring the korban Pesach first time round, even though that the majority are tamei. So Rav Huna Amar, ein tashlum lePesach haba b'tumah. So they cannot bring the korban Pesach in the makeup date in the 14th of Iyar in Pesach Sheni. They can't bring the korban Pesach then because the majority of community was tamei and brought the korban Pesach already. So you can't have a makeup date on account of, I was tamei, when the entire community was tamei and brought the korban Pesach. So even though that this particular person or these minority of people were tamei in a form of tumah that couldn't bring the korban Pesach first time round, nevertheless, they can't bring it the second time round. And Rabbi Barava says, no, you could have a makeup date and you get a chance to redo it on the Pesach Sheni, even though that the Pesach in first time round was brought as a communal tamei, in communal tumah. Name it b'hakim epagi. So what's the basis of the machlokas? Let's say this is it. The one that says that there's no makeup date for a Pesach that comes in tumah says, look, tumah kasava tumah d'chuyu b'tziva. And this is a concept we've seen multiple times now, that the bris is at 9 a.m. Oregon time, which is in 3 hours or 2.5 hours. So the tumah, the concept that when the community is tamei that they would bring the korban Pesach even though that they would bring the Korban Pesach, even though they are Tameh. So we say have a mitzvah that supersedes the Tumah. Do we say that mitzvah supersedes the Tumah? It completely removes the prohibition of bringing Korban Tumah. That's hutra, that it's permissible at this point. Or do we say no, the prohibition is in place and the mitzvah is stronger and supersedes it, but the mitzvah is still in place. The prohibition is still in place of bringing Korban and Tumah, and therefore we try to mitigate that as much as possible because we still have a prohibition in place. And so since it's only with limited because of the obligation, as much as needed and no more, do we allow for someone to bring the Korban Pesach. So the bringing of the Korban Pesach would not allow for anybody that's tamei to be pushed for the second towards the second Pesach if they didn't bring it the first time round. And the one that says that you can't call it a proper Pesach and it's a Pesach above Tumah, that's the reason is because says no, that the prohibition of Tumah never was completely removed, and this is a totally valid and proper Korban Pesach. And just like any Korban Pesach, whoever's tamei and couldn't bring it the first time brings it the second Pesach. So too here. So essentially, the reasoning why you would say that the Zavin could bring it a second time is because Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. So this is a regular Korban Pesach. The prohibition of bringing it in Tumah it has been removed, or do we say no, that they cannot bring a Korban Pesach the second time around because this is an abnormal Korban Pesach. It's not a Korban Pesach that was completely allowed. It's only because it supersedes the Tumah, but really there's a prohibition in place to bring this Korban Pesach, and it's not strong enough to allow somebody to have a makeup date for missing it. Amri Gemara says no, that's not the reasoning. Everybody will say that the prohibition of Tumah is still in place, and therefore this is not a typical Korban Pesach because it's being done while there's a prohibition on it. Rather, Machlekes is based on this Mar Savar, and now we turn to pay Amid base ADB. Mar Savar Tahara Matchitum. It can supersede a tahor korban can push a tamei person to the second Pesach. But if the korban itself was brought betuma, the Korban Pesach was brought while the community was tamei, that's not strong enough or not reason enough to push someone who's tamei to the second Pesach. What's your argument? Well, I was tamei, I couldn't bring the first Pesach. Well, so was everybody else, right? And even though that's true, that but your form of tumah, what didn't allow for you to bring the Korban Pesach the first time round, but it allowed everybody else to bring it. I understand, but that means that the Korban Pesach wasn't strong enough or wasn't the form of Pesach, a Korban Pesach that allows the postponement for somebody who is tamei. And the other says no, that even a korban that's tamei, the communal korban being brought in Tumah is sufficient to push the individuals, that the minority that were tamei, to the second Korban Pesach, to Pesach Sheni. Now, Itmar, so we had a case where the majority of the community was tamei of Zav, the minority tamei Mace. We had the second case was the majority of the community were tamei Mace from contact to a dead person, and the minority were Zav, and now we have equal thirds. A third of the community, Shlishisan Zavin, 1/3 were Zav, meaning from a bodily fluid, Shlishisan Tahari, a third were Tahar, and Shlishisan Tamei Mason, and a third were Tamei from coming into contact with the dead. So we have the majority of the community Tamei, but that majority that's tamei, that's 66%, that's tamei, half of them are tamei Mace, which can bring the korban now, and half are tamei Zav, which cannot bring the korban now. So what's Allah? Amar Rav Mani Bar Patish. Oisen Tamei Mason, Eno Oisa Leisa Risha V'Leisa Sheni. Anybody that's Tamei Mace cannot bring the first Pesach or the second Pesach. Barisha Liavli, they can't bring the first Pesach because Higdilu Zavan al Taharin, the Zav, which is not a form of Tumah, the Zavin, which are not a form of Tumah now, and the Mitzara, which is not a form of the Zav, which is not a form of Tumah that can bring the Karban Pesach now, and the people that are Tahor, that people that are able to bring the Karban Pesach themselves will combine to be a majority over the people that are Tamei Mace, and so now the Tamei Mace are minority, and so that does not postpone the Pesach for them. So it doesn't allow them to bring the Karban Pesach while they're in Tamei. So those that are Tamei Mace, those that are Tamei on account of coming to contact with dead people, they are the minority. So the minority being Tamei of the form of Tumah Mace is not going to allow them to bring the Karban Pesach yet. Now, B'Sheni Lihavdi, they also cannot bring the Karban Pesach B'Sheni in the second Pesach. Why not? Nitztar for Zavim and Tamei Mason, because the minority that came into contact with the dead and their tummy, and the minority that are tummy from a bodily fluid, both of them could not do the Pesach first time round. They didn't do the Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. And when the 14th of Sivan comes, you have a majority of people that didn't come to Pesach. Havalu Ruba, because that becomes a majority. Ruba Matri Pesach Sheni, and the majority cannot be postponed to do the Pesach Sheni. They cannot do the Pesach Sheni only if they are minority. If the majority of the community did not do the first Pesach on account of being tummy, they are not postponed to the second Pesach. HaPesach, the next mission. HaPesach shenizrak damai. The Karban Pesach that it's shenizrak damai va'achar kach neidashu tamei. The Karban Pesach that was brought properly, and the blood was spritzed on the mizbeach, and then it became known that the Karban itself, either the lamb or the blood being spritzed, were tamei themselves. The lamb itself is tamei. The Karban itself is tamei. So since it was brought and the blood was spritzed with the intent of it being valid, and at the time the person thought it was valid, hatzitz maratza. So the tzitz is going to validate that, as we've seen that the golden plate that the Kohen wore on his forehead, gold that says Kodesh Hashem, the tzitz is going to be maratza, validate the Karban Pesach, even though that it was tamei. Nitma haguf ein tzitz maratza. But if the person himself became tamei, then the tzitz does not validate it, and he would have to bring the Karban Pesach the second time around. So if the lamb itself became tamei, the tzitz validates the Karban, and he fulfilled the mitzvah of bringing the Karban Pesach. Now, obviously, he can't eat it unless it was a majority of the community tamei. But he can't eat the Karban Pesach. But nevertheless, he'll have fulfilled the mitzvah of bringing the Karban Pesach. It doesn't have to bring the second Pesach. Whereas if he himself became tamei, that would invalidate the Karban Pesach, and he would have to bring it again the second time round in Pesach Sheni. Mipnei she'amru an-nazir v'yiseh Pesach hatzitz maratz al tumas adam and hatzitz maratz al tumas haguf. Because in regards to the nazir, And regards to the Pesach, we saw this earlier. These are two karbanos that require the eating of the karban. And if the person is incapable or not valid to eat the karban Pesach on account of a personal tumah, the tzitz will atone for only the karban being tummy, but not for the person himself being tummy. Now, there's a new concept that we're going to encounter, nitma tumasatahim. If it literally means if it became tummy from a tumah that's underneath the ground. But the concept really means that it's a type of tumah that he couldn't have known in advance that he was tummy. And somebody finds out that I'm tummy before already, but there was no way that I could have known. So tzitz maratza. For that, the tzitz will atone for and essentially validate a carbon of such a form of unknowable tumah, even retroactive. So the Gemara now explains. The first line in the Mishnah said that if the karban Pesach had been spritzed, and then you found out that the person was tamei, that the karban was tamei, so then the tzitz will atone for it. So taima the nizrak, it's only after you find out after it's already been spritzed. And then you found out nizrak, but at first you knew already that the person was the karban was tamei, the blood was tamei, or the lamb was tamei, and then you spritz the blood nevertheless. It does not validate it. The tzitz doesn't validate it. I have a contradiction on that. Amatzitz maratza. We learned this earlier, and this is Gemara in Yuma. What does the tzitz atone for and make the karban valid? Aladam, for the blood that became tummy, or valabasar, or if the meat of the karban became tummy, valachelev, or the fats of the karban that became tummy. Shenitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid bein b'aynes bein b'ratzin. If it became tummy, and now there's a question where to put this comma here. That became tummy, regardless of whether it's knowing or unknowing, willingly or under duress, in a communal or individual karban. Now, where do we put this comma? We can put the comma on the spritzing, right? And when somebody spritz the blood or the meat or the fats, whether it became tamei, and regardless of whether you did it willingly or unknowingly, that you spritzed it. So the Gemara says no. The meaning, the comma is before shenitma, before it became tamei, and you read it like this: Amar Avina tumasai be'mashag be'mezid hortza. You don't read it that it became tamei. You don't read it that it was spritzed in knowingly or unknowingly, but rather it became tamei. That it became tamei regardless whether it became tamei knowingly or became tamei unknowingly. However, but the spritzing, zrikasei, but the spritzing has to be that you didn't know that it was tamei, and then the tzitz will make it valid. But if you knew that it was tamei and you spritzed it anyhow, the tzitz would not make it valid. Rabbi Shela, and Rabbi Shela says no, that even if you intentionally spritzed it knowing that it was tamei, it'll still be valid. That the tzitz validates it. But the question is how it became tamei. Did it become tamei unknowingly? That's okay. Then the tzitz will validate it. But mezid, if you intentionally made it tamei, the tzitz will not validate it.
So this is when it says it's hurtza, means that he could go ahead and eat the korban?
No. Hurtza means that the korban counts as a valid korban and fulfills the obligation the person had.
But not but a chile can't do.
Correct. You can only eat a korban that's tamei in a communal korban that's tamei. There's no eating of a korban. It's just a question of whether the korban is validated itself. Thank you, Michael, for pointing that out. That's a key point here. So Rav Shela says that the spritzing, regardless of whether you knew it was tamei or not, and you spritz it intentionally, it's going to be valid. But the becoming tamei, there it depends. If you intentionally made the lamb tamei, so it's not going to, the tzitz will not atone for it, not validate it. And this that it said in the Brisa that that it became tamei regardless of whether it's intentional or unintentional. This is the way he reads it. Nitma b'shoigeg, if it became tamei inadvertently, and zarka, and then he spritzed it, regardless if he spritzed the bein b'shoigeg bein b'mezid, whether he intentionally or unintentionally spritzed it after he knew it was tamei. Hurtza, it's going to be validated by the tzitz. And our Mishnah that says that he spritzed it before he knew about it, right? Why didn't it give you the scenario that he knew about it and spritzed it anyhow? It's going to be valid. It's only because he spritzed it and then he found out that the blood or the lamb was tamei. But if he first knew that it was tamei and still spritzed it, it would seem that would not be valid. The Gemara says, no, even if he spritzed it and then if he knew about the tumah and spritzed it anyhow, it'll be valid. So why did it say it the other way around in our Mishnah? Mishnah Boilam is to say it because in the end it needs to say it in the reverse. Nitma haguf by himself when he became tamei, the person became tamei. Eina tzitz meratza, the tzitz does not validate the carbon. There, even if he didn't know it by the time he spritzed it, that even though he spritzed it and didn't know that the owner was tamei, and then the found out that the owner was tamei, it's still not going to be valid, and the tzitz will not validate it because it doesn't validate in the carbon. These two karmanos where the need is to eat it, it doesn't validate where the person itself is tamei. Tani Reishanami. So the scenario of the Mishnah, to keep it symmetrical, is all talking about that he spritzed it and then found out of tumah, and nevertheless, in the end, it's not going to be valid. So now we get into this concept of tumas hatahim, where there was it was an unknowable tumah prior, and that would retroactively be valid, even when you find out that there was tumah. The tzitz would make it valid because it was unknowable at that time. So by Rabbi Bachama, for whom does this work? Rabbi Bachama asked, does this work only for the tumah of the person of the owner of the carbon, or even an unknown tumah, unknowable tumah of the kohen himself? So kohen amaratz b'karban asayim, the kohen who's bringing their carbon, hutru lo tumas hatayim aloi. When he brings the carbon of such forms of carbon that a personal tumah is not validated by the tzitz, such as the nazir and the pesach. When the kohen brings this and doesn't know that he himself is tamei and couldn't know, does that validate it for him? Or do we say no? It only works. Mi amrina and ki gemiri tumas hatayim b'ba'alim. Do we say that we only learned this concept? And it's a halacha l'mashem Sinai. It's a new concept. It's not in the Torah written. It's in the Torah by oral tradition. So the halacha l'mashem Sinai is by tumas hatayim only for the owners, or b'koyin lo gemiri, and we didn't learn it about the koyin. Or do we learn it as a general concept of carbon and leishna koyin or leishna ba'alim, and it doesn't make a difference if the koyin is the person that's tamei, the koyin who's doing the service, or the ba'alim, the owner, is the person who is obligated to bring this carbon, is the one that has a personal tumah on his body. Amar Rava. So Rava said, Tashema, let's prove it from this brisa. The Tani Rabbi Chia taught in a brisa. Here he introduces a new question, or really a statement about which tumah did you not know about that this would be valid for. And so he says it's only for the tumah of mace. The tumah of having come into contact with a grave, with a dead person, which is in a tahom, which is unknowable. You couldn't have known that this was there. This that Rabbi Chia said specifically by the tumah of coming into contact with the dead. What's he excluding? Wouldn't you say that he's excluding having come into contact with a dead rodent? And now, whom would that be a problem for? Who would be, what are we talking about? It can't be talking about the owner. Why? Because Baman, Ibn Nazir, if the owner is a Nazir and sending his carbon and he became tamei unbeknownst to him and unknowable by coming into contact with a rodent, is there even this concept of a tumah. Ki yamas meis alav amarachmana. The Torah specifically says by a nazir that the inadvertent tumah of the nazir is talking about where a person died, and that's the tumah that's going to require the reprocess of the nazir. So it must be that we were talking about the kohen became tameh of coming into contact with the owner would have come into contact with a rodent and he sent a carbon pesach. Well, actually, that's valid. Well, at least there's one opinion that says it's not valid. But according to the opinion, as we saw earlier, that you can somebody who was from coming into contact with a rodent, a sheretz, who can go to the mikveh, and that night he can eat the carbon pesach. So he's allowed to send someone to bring the carbon pesach for him today on the 14th, because by the time it comes to eat the carbon pesach, he'll be valid, and there's no problem. So it can't be talking about tumah sheretz of the owner. Must be that it's talking about the tumah sheretz of the kohen. So that's the way we're trying to prove this. So hashta tumah yedua, even if he knew he came into contact with a rodent, he's allowed to send the carbon pesach because he can eat it that night. Tumah satayim like kosher. If he had no idea he was tummy, for sure it's going to be valid. Elalat b'kohen. It must be that the fact that Rabbi Chia said only a tamei mace has the concept of an unknowable tumah of a tumas tahim, which tells us that if he was, but not a rodent, not somebody come into contact with a rodent, and that couldn't be speaking about the owner, because a nazir that doesn't apply to, and in a Pesach, at least to one opinion, it doesn't apply to. So therefore, must not be talking about the owner doesn't know that he came into contact with a sheretz, but rather the kohen. That proves that this concept of tumas hatahom, of the unknowable tumah, is in reference to the kohen doing the service as well. So the Gemara says, Amar of Yosef loy. That's not a good proof at all. Really, it's in reference to the owner. Pesach, and it's talking about a carbon pesach. And even though you said wait, but it's excluding the tumas sheretz, somebody who came into contact with a rodent, and that I don't need to exclude because the owner can send, even if we know that he's tummy sheretz, he can send it. Yeah, you're right. It's not talking about an exclusion of the tummy sheretz. It's talking about to exclude the tumah of ziva, that he couldn't have known that he was a zav. And what's the scenario? This is a bodily fluid that comes out. How do you not know about that? And the miyute tumas hatahim the ziva, and it's excluding the tumas hatahim of ziva, but tumas hatahim the ziva lemeratze, and that doesn't work. But how do we learn? Rabbi Yossi Omer. So here we have the scenario. Rabbi Yossi says shemeres yom keneged yom. So there are two types of zav. There's ziva of a male and of a female. So in the tumah of a female, an abnormal flow. The first day that there's an abnormal flow, she does not become a zava. It's just a shemeres yom keneged yom. She watches that day and sees whether the next day is the same, and if the next day is the same, and then there's a third day, 3 consecutive days in a row where there's the same abnormal flow, that would become a zava gedola. So a great zava. So there's a shemeres yom keneged yom. Sheshachta v'zar kollel. And now she sends a carbon pesach, a carbon, and the carbon is brought on her behalf on the second day, which is a day that she's guarding and watching whether or not she's going to have the flow again and be tummy, but she didn't yet, so she has no reason to know that retroactively she's going to be tummy. And only after she went to the mikveh that day did she, and she hadn't seen anything all day. That's when she became, she saw again and became tummy the second day. So Eina Achelas, she can't eat the carbon pesach because she has to wait until the next day to see whether or not she's going to be a Zava Gedola, whether she's going to have a third day. However, Peturim and Lasa Pesach Sheni, she'll be exempt of the second Pesach because after all, at the time that she shechted and the blood was spritzed, there was and no way of knowing that she was going to be still tummy now. In other words, it was unknowable, an unknowable tumah, because she already went to the mikveh, and if she became tummy again, it would retroactively connect to the previous day. But she couldn't know it at that time. So the spritzing of the blood of the korban is essentially a tumas atahom, an unknowable tumah, and retroactively going to be valid because the tzitz will validate it. My time, maratza tzitz, isn't it because it tzitz maratza? And so we see that by zav there is such a concept of a unknowable tumah retroactive, and that tzitz will validate it. Amri lo. So he says no, that's not the reason of Rabbi Yossi. It's not because it was a tumas atahom, an unknowable tumah. Rather, mishum de kasav Rabbi Yossi mikana abahu matama. The zava, that it doesn't connect to the previous day. It's a new start of Tumah. And the Gemara, we'll see later, is going to ask, well, then how do you have a 3 consecutive day of Tumah if, according to Rabbi Yossi, each day is going to count independently because it was a break? So the Gemara says, wait, V'atadni Rabbi Yossi mezav bal shtei re'iyos. And here we'll see what Rabbi Yossi says in regards to a male zav, which is a bodily fluid that's different than a semen emission. It's thicker and whiter, so that let's call it gonorrhea. And he has 2 emissions. A third emission would make him tummy for 8 days because he's 7 days of tumah plus the 8th day has to bring a carbon. So he had 2 tumas, two sightings. And he has a tumah of 7 days, and they brought a carbon pesach for him on the 7th day of his tumah. Now, if he gets a third omission, that would on this 7th day, and then on this day that they brought the carbon, retroactively it would undo the 7-day count he had. So it's retroactive that he had a tumah, and he couldn't have known that this tumah would be there. And also a shemer sim keneged yom, a woman who had an abnormal flow on one day, and she's checking the next day to see whether or not there'll be another flow. That the carbon was brought for her b'sheni shala on her 2nd day. And then after the carbon was brought, and you couldn't have known that it was later going to become invalid retroactively. So, retroactively, all of the things that they sat on or laid on, which are a tumah zav of the pressure that for something that they sat on or laid on, is going to be retroactive. So you see, it's not a future tumah; it's even a retroactive tumah. And and they would be exempt of bringing the carbon pesach 2nd time round, meaning that this time around the carbon pesach worked, even though that it's retroactive tumah. Amrim ma'ilem afreya midrabanan. He says, yeah, really retroactively there's no tumah. As we said, Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that these bodily fluids, the zav and zava, where they're waiting and counting the day to see whether it's going to be valid, whether she'll be clean, or he's waiting to see whether he can get through the 7 days of tahara without having another emission. The retroactive tumah on items that they sat on or laid on, that's going to be a derabana. And how do we know that? As we see, also Rabbi Shaya says that this tumah is a retroactive rabbinic tumah, and from the Torah it actually is not a retroactive tumah, it's from here on, and therefore the carbon pesach will be valid because they fulfilled the mitzvah at a time that they were not tameh, and the tumah that came afterwards is from there on and not retroactive. Where do we know that the retroactive tumah is the rabbanan? The time we learned, Rabbi Shaya said, aval, however, and as Rashi points out, this however is referring to something beforehand, and it's unclear what that beforehand is on the side of the Gemara. They have an explanation or potential explanation. In any case, what's relevant to our conversation is zav shara b'shvi shala, a male zav, meaning someone who had this this abnormal semen emission. Let's call it gonorrhea. Zav shara b'shvi shalai, that saw a tumah on his seventh day of clean days, meaning he's waiting 7 days. It retroactively invalidates the 7 days that had been he had already been waiting to become tahor. Rabbi Yochanan says no, it's not a retroactive invalidation. It doesn't undo the 7 days that he counts. Rather, he can start counting from one, and today counts. And the Gemara says, wait, if it retroactively is tumah, so I could see that even today shouldn't count. All right. It only undoes today. Says why? Why do you lose today? If it's not retroactive, so then today you had part of the day already that was clean and it should count. Do you say that it's retroactive? So it should undo all 7 days. Now, and if you tell me it's only from here onward, so then today should count because this is a new tumah that happened 2 p.m, let's say, but all day today there was tahara, and part of the day counts as a full day, and so it should be enough. What Rabbi Yochanan meant to say is that it doesn't even undo today. It's a new tumah from here on, and he can count every single day up, including today, as his clean days, and so you would have a 7th clean day. And to that Rabbi Yossi said, and that they said, Rabbi Yossi agrees to you, Rabbi Yochanan, that it's not retroactive. Now, the Gemara says, but wait, how can you say Rabbi Yossi said it didn't say it's retroactive? Or Rabbi Yossi, but we had seen that Rabbi Yossi says that when a zav sat on a chair, that chair is retroactively tummy. Must be that this sitting on something that would be a retroactive tumah for a zav is rabbinic. Shmamina. So indeed, we learned that. So now what we have is that Rabbi Yossi says that the reason for the zav counting as a valid carbon when they brought it, not unbeknownst to them, that they were going to be that they will have a flow, an abnormal flow that day, which would send them back into a tumah. That's not because it was a tumah at the time, it was an unknowable tumah. Rather, it's not. It's because the tumah is a new tumah from here onward, and the tumah itself, in the morning or that afternoon when they brought the carbon pesach, or they had someone bring the carbon pesach for them, it's valid because they were in tumah, and even later they didn't become retroactively tumah. So that's why it's a valid carbon, and they don't have to do the pesach, the second pesach. Now the Gemara says, so if that's the case, that according to Rabbi Yossi, the tumah is only from here onward. So why did we see earlier that Rabbi Chia said that only in regards to a deceased person, a tumas mace, a tumah of coming into contact with the dead, do we have this concept of tumas atahom, an unknowable tumah, excluding what? Lameis bavad lemiutimai nifshat mina. So perhaps we can indeed bring proof. The B'koyin, that it's talking about a Kohen having come into contact with a sheretz, and he couldn't have known about it. And we can see that even a Kohen has the valid form of the validation of a carbon on account of Tumas HaToim. Amri, so we say, we're still talking about that the owner is the one that became Tomei in an unknowable Tumah. Ube Pesach, and let's talk about a carbon Pesach. And this opinion of Rabbi Chia, Kesavar, Ein Shechtem V'Zaykein Al Tomei Sheretz, that the owner may not send this carbon Pesach if he's Tomei Sheretz. And therefore, therefore he's invalid to send the carbon Pesach if he had come into contact with a rodent. And if he's unknowable form of coming into contact, a Tumas HaToim, where he couldn't have known that he came into contact, where I would think that the tzitz would validate that. To that, Rabbi Chia says no. It only validates it in an unknowable tumah of coming into contact with the dead, a tumas mace, but not a tumas sheretz. And therefore we have to exclude it. Fine. So we don't have proof of whether or not the Kohen is included in this validation if he couldn't have known of his tumah. Now the Gemara goes back to the question that we mentioned. According to Rabbi Yossi, a shomeres yom keneged yom is a zava, a woman who had an abnormal flow, meaning not in the days that you would expect that she would have the flow, bodily fluid flow. This is the tumah that comes more than 11 days after the menstrual flow. Sorry, within the 11 days after the menstrual flow, which is an abnormal time to have a flow again. And so one day would make her tameh for a day. And then the next day, she would have to check and see whether or not there is a flow. If it happened a second time, they would check for a third day. And if it happens 3 times in a row, that's a zava gedola, the great zava. She has to count 7 clean days, etc. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, seeing once on one day and then seeing again on the second day, they don't connect because the second tumah is from here onward and not retroactive. So the Gemara says, so how do you ever have a concept of a zava gedola? How do you ever have them connected? Elo Rabbi Yossi zava gemura, what's the case? So the first case says b'shofas, where it's a continual flow as opposed to just once on one day and once on the other day, which we would consider more like staining and so on. This is a continual flow from for 3 days, light as it may be, a 3-day flow. Or perhaps the in between the sunset and nightfall of the between the first and second day into the second day, that entire time was when that flow was. So it counts as day 1, and it also counts as day 2. So therefore, you have the connector between the days. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef now asks a kohen who's bringing the carbon the daily carbon. This concept that we saw earlier, that there's a tumas hatahim, unknowable tumah that the tzitz validates. What about if it's the daily carbon, which is a carbon that's the obligation of the community, and the kohen is bringing it on behalf of the community, and it's permissible even in tumah? That we say that the tzitz would validate the unknowable tumah or not. So it's true we had this question about when he was bringing a carbon for the nazir, for the individual carbon of the person who had accepted the vow of nazirus, or the pesach. That maybe over there it's valid. What about over here? Do we say this halacha l'Moshe Sinai, this new idea that we have by tradition from Sinai, that an unknowable tumah that sits would validate? Is that true? Retroactively valid? Is that only by a Pesach or even by the daily Talmud? Or do we say we learn the Talmud from Pesach? And tomorrow we'll continue with this question.